Russia just suffered the heaviest plane losses supposedly since World War II ended in one single day. We'll talk about this in this situational picture, as well as about the developments along the front line, where the Russians are attacking at several parts of the front line, while the Russian mill bloggers are increasingly getting desperate and more afraid of the Ukrainian side opening a completely new front. As said, this and more in this situational picture about the Ukraine war. Hello and welcome. We'll start initially with a summary of the air attacks. There have been a new wave of Russian attacks on the Ukrainian rear. Some of them were done with Kh-59 cruise missiles. Also, an Iskander ballistic missile was used, as well as Shahid drones. Of course, Ukrainians claim that they shot down a certain number of this, but a significant part still got through. We'll go to the developments to the front, fighting along the front. In the north here on the Eastern Front, we have continued fighting close to Kupiansk. I do not see any change in territory here, but we do have a Ukrainian mill blogger admitting that close to Orlyanka they lost some positions. As you can see here on the map, we are simply talking about a few meters and a tree line, but then to put it in perspective, this is more or less how the front develops from any side. So Ukrainians, if they advance, they usually don't advance any more than this either. This success from the Russians has happened here at Orlyanka, somewhere in this region. So there the Russians advanced somewhat. The Ukrainian ground forces commander General Syrsky, said the Russians are trying to break through between Svatove and Kremina. So we are definitely no longer at a phase where we can just talk about a diversionary offensive. At least according to the Ukrainians, this seems to be more and more serious. The Russians seem to be more and more showing their intention to seriously break through to the Oskil at the very least, or further to the west here. The Sherebets will likely be the first target. We have it here in some parts. The Sherebets is still behind the front line, while they, for instance, crossed it here between Raihorodka and Novovodiane a few weeks ago. And after that, the Oskil will likely be the next goal, should they be able to break through here. Further south, fighting is also continuing, but I cannot record any change in territory in the Bakhmut region, so we'll immediately skip it and go further south. Here, the Russians tried surprise attack, surprise offensive, both from the north, Krasnohorivka, roughly in southwestern direction, and from Vodiane northwards to encircle the units in the Ukrainian units in Avdiivka. They wanted to create a encirclement there, or at least a turning maneuver, forcing the Ukrainians to retreat from this. This has had partial successes. Some advances are being recorded, but it's already, the successes are being reduced. They are slowing down massively after initial attacks with massed infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, where the Russians suffered serious losses. According to reports from the front line, they are now switching mostly to infantry attacks, as they are usually being called meat attacks. So mostly infantry being sent forward with maybe a handful of armored vehicles somewhere in the background supporting them from longer distance, but no longer the attempt to push through. What happened to the waste heap is not completely known to me. Here is a coke plant, and the waste of it is being created here to make an artificial hill. This is a very important position, as it is artificial, so it's standing out completely from the surrounding, offering perfect overview and great line of sight and great line to open fire, obviously, as well. There was a geolocalization of a dead Russian soldier here in the south, and the Russians claimed they were fighting inside of the coke plant. I cannot confirm that they actually advanced that far. At least I haven't found any evidence of this, but as of now, the Ukrainians seem to be completely in control of the waste heap. Whether that was a misidentification or whether the Russians actually managed to capture it, but Ukrainian counterattacks managed to recapture it, is not completely clear to me, but it would make sense that the Ukrainian would put everything they have in reserves to recapture it, as this is really the importance of that hill should not be underestimated. It is dominating the overall surrounding here, and thus losing it would seriously weaken the Ukrainian position. Still, though, as far as I see it, they have managed to at least recapture it or are still holding it. So while the front in the north seems to be stabilized for the moment, in the south there have been some successes by the Russians. The Russians managed to capture this area directly south, or if we want southeast of Avdiivka. While we are again just talking about a few meters, this is of importance. You can see here, this is the ceasefire line for the war of 2014-15, or ceasefire, as you know, it's like a fluid term. It was a fluid term in this region, but here was where the front line had stabilized after the initial fighting until February 2024. Now there's movement again, but the Russians, since the Russians did their full-scale invasion, there was barely any movement here. The whole area, you can see how little the Russians have advanced from that red line from their initially occupied territory, and now they managed to advance somewhat directly at Avdiivka. This is important in the sense that there hasn't been movement there for months, even for a year and a half. They also not just managed to capture this, but also roughly this area here is now captured by the Russians as well. Again, usually we're talking about a few tree lines and a few trenches, but still, as said, if the Ukrainians are advancing, we are not talking about something else either. So the movement is going on here. Fighting is continuing. But as of now, the Avdiivka is nowhere close from being enveloped, but the Russians seem to be intending to continue doing it and to forcing a result here. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, seem to have had some success north of Marinka. They were geolocalized here and here. I have the pictures here where TOS 1 has fired at Ukrainians, and they were geolocalized in here and in that building. This is here on the gray area, so either that, from what I've seen, they must have captured that area now, so the gray area should be somewhat further east to that. So a minor advance by the Ukrainians in this position. That was, although that was more or less it from that area, I cannot report any change from the Vuhledar region, Novomikhailivka and so on. Nothing changed here. Even south of Velika Novosilka, I cannot record any change. Of course, they're still fighting, but no result to it that I can record. South of Orechiv, there's also fighting still going on. We have Wargonzo, the Russian mill blogger, writing on the 14th of October, that there was minor progress by the Ukrainians to push west from Robotine in the direction of Kopani. So, I don't know, 50, 100 meters somewhere in the tree line, at least according to Wargonzo, but overall the front line here is for the moment no longer moving either. But further west I have no change at all, but now we come to the first important and interesting thing. Riba is reporting significant Ukrainian activity over the river. I have the picture here. Let me quickly turn off my camera so you can see it fully. We see that according to Riba, the Ukrainians cross the river and are trying to push forward in the islands here inside that are still on the other side of the river, because that's the important thing. We need to understand that this is not a full-blown bridgehead as would usually be understood, as there is still a river in between. But according to them, the Ukrainians are trying to push southeast in this whole area, advancing further, and Riba is connecting it with attacks further to the east. Riba is one of those mill bloggers that for weeks now, if not for months, are saying the Ukrainians will try to cross the river. I've reported it in the past that, for instance, Riba was among those that said that 13,000 Ukrainian Marines have arrived, perfectly probably suited to crossing a wide river like this, and now they're connecting it to the attacks that happened in Bryansk on the airfield in Bryansk, I think, not Berdyansk. Let me see. It's Berdyansk, yeah. In Berdyansk. Bryansk is in Russia. So they connected to the attacks in Berdyansk and expect further attacks south in the Crimean Peninsula, all in preparation for a Ukrainian crossing of the Dnipro in force. So Riba is still panicking about the Ukrainians actually crossing the Dnipro. This will obviously be probably one of the most difficult tasks for the Ukrainian armed forces. So I'm still skeptical to what degree this will actually happening. But we'll obviously observe it here. And we were already talking about the attack on Berdyansk, and this is what I mentioned in the teaser. We have this video here from the airport at Berdyansk. Not only this airport was attacked, but also the attack also hit Luhansk, both outside the range of HIMARS. And in both cases, the airports were filled with helicopters. We have here the satellite pictures from before, and you can see the high concentration of Russian helicopters, a lot of it protected with earthworks, but not everything. They were building it, and then again the missile used was identified because they actually even found a piece of it here lying around, and you can even identify the writing on it, MGM-140A. The MGM-140A has a range of 165 kilometers, so it's well within range. That's the ATACMS that the US have recently delivered, and while that missile is not suitable to strike the Kerch Bridge, as it has cluster munition, as I should have said here on the channel. I know I did it on my German channel, but I'm pretty sure I mentioned it here as well. While this missile is useless against the Kerch Bridge, for troop concentrations out in the open or airports, for instance, it's perfect. And now it happened. You didn't have to be like a prophet to see that airports will be the likely target, especially as the airport in Berdyansk is known to have housed significant parts of the Russian combat helicopter fleet. And what they found here is one of the pieces of the warheads that the MGM-140A is emitting, is firing out, basically, is spreading. It carries roughly 300 of those, I think 280 to 300. So let's roughly 300, spreads it over a certain area. And while that might not be good enough to kill a well-armored target, a helicopter doesn't have the armor to withstand even a small warhead like this. And it seems that the damage was significant. Russian military bloggers admit it. They say it's a disaster, a huge strike against us. They start complaining how it is possible that the helicopters were there and this vulnerable, despite knowing that ATACMS would be delivered for at least a month. I mean, the US openly said we're going to deliver them a few, and the type was known as well. The US clearly said we're not going to deliver the 300-kilometer range with a solid warhead that could be used against the Kerch Bridge, but they said we're going to deliver those with cluster warheads, where the airport of Berdyansk was one of the obvious targets. But we see the rigidity of the Russian structure, that they were unable to react in time to this, and this led to today's disaster. At least according to some commentators, this is the biggest loss of Russian aviation in a single day since World War II. I'm not really able to confirm it on the fly really fast, whether there has been a successful attack on an airport, for instance, in Afghanistan during the Afghanistan war, but it seems well possible that it is. The number of destroyed helicopters is still unclear, probably between 8 to 10, somewhere in that ballpark. It might be higher too. We'll soon have satellite imagery showing us the extent of the disaster. Here, by the way, we see the example why cluster munition is not praised, or let's say is under scrutiny. And a lot of countries have banned it and committed to not using it, because we see one that hasn't exploded here, and there's always a certain number of them not exploding, which then obviously creates an explosive hazard for the future until they are identified and cleared. We even see that it's green here, so inside of high grass it would probably be difficult to identify. But especially this is a bigger problem once older munitions are being used, and we had the production date on it here, if I recall, yes, 1096. So we are talking about an almost 30-year-old missile that was used here, and obviously the dud rate will be higher than with a freshly produced one. Still, the military value was demonstrated in this, and of course Ukraine decides to mine its own territory. That's unpleasant, but in the end it's their own decision in the defense of their own country. We have some more information about the Russian offensive towards Avdiivka. The GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, is saying they expected the offensive towards Avdiivka. They had known up front and were preparing for it. That could be an argument. While the minefields there seem to be stronger than usual from the Ukrainian side, there were several Russian military bloggers complaining about the strength of the Ukrainian minefields there. This is possible that the Ukrainians prepared for that, and they should have significant stockpiles too. We know that they got deliveries, and then of course the Russians delivered a fair amount of them as well. As we've heard in the past that the Ukrainians were forced due to circumstances to demine the areas here in the south by hand. By hand means that with an anti-tank mine you usually screw out the fuse, and if you do that you can reuse it. So it might actually, theoretically at least, be the possibility that some Russian mines cleared down here, destroyed Russian tanks up here, but that's probably too much of a stretch. Just you see that the connections are there. They can actually reuse them once they've cleared the area, once, especially anti-tank mines. With that, it's possible. Also, we have Putin talking about the offensive there. He was talking about active defense. That is being interpreted as basically keeping expectations down. He's not talking about an offensive, about active operations, more the active defense, and that obviously would not lead you to expect that Avdiivka should be captured soon. This shows us that Putin at least it gives us the impression that Putin slowly accepts the difficulty of the fighting here, as in the past, supposedly again and again he ordered his generals to capture Donbas within 2 or 3 months, and we see that the majority of it is still in Ukrainian hands. Even parts of Luhansk have been liberated again, so not even Luhansk is fully in Russian hands anymore. Also, there are pro-Ukrainian sources reporting that the Russians are sending additional reinforcements towards Avdiivka. So while we hear that the Russians have switched over to meat attacks, there is no sign that those attacks will stop soon if the Russians bring reinforcements. We can expect additional attacks going on here, and the Ukrainians are reporting a high intensity in the number of attacks, also in the number as well in the strength of the attacks. So while the situation in Avdiivka is not dramatic at this very moment, it will definitely not calm down anytime soon. At least that's what we are expecting. Also, Russians are also sending reinforcements up here, so the offensive activity there should also increase in the coming weeks. That was already it from me for now. If you like this report, please hit the thumbs up button. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment. What do you think about the attack on the Russian aerial, on the Russian combat aviation, the importance of it? And in this context, we should probably talk about the fact that this attack probably destroyed a couple of helicopters, likely, the Russians admit as much. But at the same time, it happened now in October. This is one of the themes of this whole war, that Ukraine receives everything in the end, but always far, far later than necessary. If those ATACMS had been delivered earlier, they could have been used at the end of May, taking out the combat helicopters that then exacted a heavy toll from the Ukrainian armored attacks. We've shown pictures here, images here, videos here of Russian Kamov 52 taking out Ukrainian armor from long distance with Vichar anti-tank guided missiles. If those combat helicopters had been destroyed on the ground with ATACMS, they wouldn't have been able to slow down the Ukrainian armored advances. And if the tanks had been delivered and the IFVs had been delivered not a year later, but as soon as it was clear that the war is continuing, if the preparations had been done, those armored attacks would have probably happened between September and December of last year, facing a far, far weaker Surovikin line that they actually face today. And my prediction would be that in a year from now, we will likely talk about some big successes from the Ukrainians with their F-16s, but those could have happened in June at the beginning of the counteroffensive as well. Leave your comment what you think about this situation, about the slowing down of deliveries. Do you think it's justified for the circumstances or not? As said, if you enjoyed this, leave a thumbs up for the algorithm. It really helps. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. If everything works out, in a few hours there should be an additional video about Hamas's war against Israel with some updates from that area, if as said, if everything works out. Other than that, we'll probably see each other very soon the next day. For tomorrow, the longer situation report is planned, so I'm looking forward to see you again. Thanks for your time so far. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. And as said, thank you for your time. Thanks for being here, and I'll be back.